Hello there, and welcome to another journey through history's shadows, where the questions matter more than the answers, and where sometimes the most profound truths hide in plain sight. Tonight's story is about something that has stood longer than empires, older than almost every name we remember from the ancient world. The Great Pyramid of Giza. You know the shape before you even think about it. That perfect triangle against the horizon, rising out of sand and time like a thought the earth refused to forget. But what if everything you've been told about it is incomplete? What if the greatest monument in human history wasn't built by the Egyptians at all? What if they inherited it? That's the possibility we'll explore together tonight. Not to argue with anyone, not to prove anything definitive, but simply to follow the quiet trail of evidence that starts when engineering doesn't quite match the tools, when timelines don't align with capabilities, when the most remarkable achievement in construction history sits surrounded by an almost embarrassing silence in the records of those who supposedly built it. Before we step into this mystery, take a breath. Feel where you are right now. Maybe you're driving home from another long day at the office, the radio humming quietly as city lights blur past your windshield. Maybe you're in your workshop, the familiar weight of tools in your hands, working on something that actually makes sense for a change. Maybe you're settling into that favorite chair, the one that's molded itself to your shoulders after years of late evenings, as the weight of deadlines and meetings finally lifts, and the house grows quiet around you. Wherever you are, whatever brought you to this moment of curiosity, you're about to enter a conversation that's been going on between stone and sky for thousands of years. A conversation that begins not with pharaohs or dynasties, but with the kind of practical question that keeps engineers awake at night. How the hell did they actually do it? The story begins with a man named Holbrook Sterling, though you might not recognize his name outside certain circles. Senior construction engineer for Blackstone and Associates, 32 years in the business, a man who's built everything from highway overpasses that span impossible gorges to 40-story office towers that sway gently in hurricane winds. Holbrook knows weight the way a pianist knows scales. He understands precision the way a surgeon understands anatomy. And when problems don't add up, when the mathematics refuse to balance, Holbrook Sterling notices. It was 15 years ago when Holbrook first stood at the base of the Great Pyramid, part of a construction industry tour that was supposed to be educational, maybe inspirational. The kind of trip that successful men take when they want to see what their predecessors accomplished with inferior tools and unlimited time. Holbrook expected to be impressed. He expected to feel that comfortable superiority that comes from knowing how much easier the job would be with modern equipment. Instead, he felt something no textbook had prepared him for. The creeping, uncomfortable awareness that he was looking at something impossible. You see, Holbrook Sterling wasn't a dreamer or a conspiracy theorist. He was a man who understood tonnage the way other men understand sports statistics. He calculated stress loads for a living, supervised crews that moved mountains of concrete and steel, knew exactly what human hands could and cannot accomplish with the tools available to them. His business card might have said senior engineer, but his real job was making the impossible merely expensive. And when Holbrook walked the Giza Plateau that first time, searching for any trace of the construction infrastructure that should have dwarfed the pyramid itself, he found almost nothing. Some tool fragments scattered in the sand, some foundations of worker housing, but nothing remotely proportional to the scale of what supposedly happened there. It was like finding the Hoover Dam with no evidence that heavy machinery had ever existed, like discovering the Golden Gate Bridge with nothing but a few hand tools left behind as proof of how it was built. The numbers haunted him during the flight home. 2.3 million stone blocks, each weighing between 2 and 70 tons. Even assuming the most efficient ancient construction methods, even granting unlimited manpower and perfect weather, the infrastructure required should have been massive. Roads capable of bearing incredible weight, ramps that would have required more stone than the pyramid itself, staging areas, equipment storage, worker housing for tens of thousands of people, the kind of footprint that leaves scars on the landscape for millennia. But when Holbrook searched the archaeological record, that infrastructure simply wasn't there. Not buried, not eroded away, not repurposed for other projects, gone, as if it had never existed. As if 2.3 million tons of stone had somehow lifted itself into perfect geometric arrangement through force of will alone. The traditional story tells us the Great Pyramid was built around 2580 BCE during the reign of Pharaoh Khufu, a project requiring decades of labor and tens of thousands of workers, copper chisels and wooden ramps, rope and muscle power, and the kind of organizational genius that could coordinate the largest construction project in human history, using tools that would barely qualify as antiques in a modern hardware store. The logistics alone should have required moving the equivalent of a small mountain of ramps and support materials to the site. Yet no trace of that infrastructure has ever been found. Not the stumps of the massive wooden ramps that would have stretched for miles. Not the quarry sites for the millions of tons of additional stone needed for construction support. Not the harbors where countless barges would have delivered materials from distant quarries. Nothing. What Holbrook found instead was precision. The kind of precision that made him uncomfortable as a professional engineer. The way a master craftsman might feel uncomfortable watching a machine reproduce in minutes what took him years to perfect. The pyramid's base is level to within just 2.1 centimeters across its entire 230-meter length. That's like building a football field and having the surface flat to within less than an inch. Even with modern laser leveling equipment, achieving that accuracy across such a massive area represents a significant engineering challenge. With copper tools and wooden measuring devices, it should be impossible. But impossible seemed to be the pyramid's specialty. The stones themselves told an even more troubling story. Holbrook had spent years working with granite, that stubborn, unforgiving rock that dulls the best modern cutting tools and demands respect from every piece of machinery that touches it. The granite blocks in the king's chamber weighed up to 70 tons each, and were fitted together with joints so tight that you couldn't slide a business card between them. The surfaces were polished to mirror smoothness, with tool marks suggesting cutting techniques that belonged in a modern machine shop, not a Bronze Age construction site. When Colonel James Hartwell from the Pentagon's Structural Engineering Division examined these blocks during a classified assessment in 2008, his internal report contained a single haunting conclusion that would later circulate quietly among engineering professionals. The precision tolerances observed exceed the capabilities of known ancient technology by several orders of magnitude. Replication would require advanced machinery not available to Bronze Age civilizations. Hartwell wasn't some academic theorist speculating from an ivory tower. He was a man who had overseen the construction of military installations designed to withstand nuclear attack, who understood the cutting edge of modern engineering capabilities. His assessment carried the weight of practical experience with the most demanding construction projects on Earth. And his conclusion was clear. The pyramid represented engineering achievement that surpassed even contemporary military standards. But precision wasn't the only problem. There was the issue of erosion. Dr. Sarah Buchanan from Harvard's Archaeology Department had spent her career studying weathering patterns in desert environments. She could read stone the way a detective reads crime scenes, interpreting the subtle signatures left by wind and water, heat and cold, the patient work of time itself. When she examined the Sphinx enclosure and the lower courses of the Great Pyramid, she found something that didn't belong to the climate of ancient Egypt. The erosion patterns were vertical, deep and rounded. The kind of weathering caused by sustained rainfall over thousands of years. Not the horizontal scour marks you'd expect from wind and sand, the familiar signatures of desert wear that marked every other ancient structure in Egypt. These were the signatures of water flowing over stone, heavy, consistent rainfall of the kind that transforms landscapes and nourishes civilizations. The problem was devastatingly simple. Egypt hasn't experienced that kind of climate for over 8,000 years. The Sahara had dried out long before the first pharaoh ever drew breath, before the first hieroglyph was carved, before the concept of Egyptian civilization had even formed in the minds of Nile Valley farmers. The climate that could have created the erosion patterns Dr. Buchanan documented belonged to a different epoch entirely. An epoch when Egypt wasn't a desert kingdom, but a green, rain-swept landscape dotted with lakes and rivers, when the ancestors of the pharaohs were still hunting gazelles across grasslands that stretched beyond the horizon. This evidence had been sitting in plain sight for decades, documented in archaeological reports that gathered dust in university libraries. But like so many uncomfortable discoveries that don't fit established timelines, it was easier to ignore than to confront. Because to accept the implications would mean acknowledging that the pyramid might be far older than Egyptian civilization itself. It would mean rewriting not just Egyptian history, but human history. Holbrook Sterling's engineering background made it impossible for him to ignore the mathematics of the problem. Numbers don't lie, don't compromise, don't care about academic careers or established theories. They simply are. And the numbers surrounding the Great Pyramid told a story that mainstream archaeology seemed determined not to hear. When Michael Torres from Caterpillar's Heavy Machinery Division ran the calculations on moving the pyramid's stone blocks, the results were sobering enough to keep construction executives awake at night. Even with modern equipment, the project would require a coordinated effort involving hundreds of pieces of heavy machinery, working around the clock for years. Massive cranes, specialized transport vehicles, precision cutting equipment, computer-controlled positioning systems. The kind of infrastructure that costs billions and requires decades to develop. The ancient Egyptians supposedly accomplished the same task with copper chisels, wooden sleds, and rope. The disconnect was so profound that Torres initially thought he'd misunderstood the scope of the project. He ran the numbers again, then a third time, each calculation confirming what his professional instincts had told him from the beginning. "Look," Torres explained to Holbrook during a construction conference in Chicago, his weathered hands sketching diagrams on hotel napkins as other executives gathered around their table. "I've moved mountains, literally, strip mining, dam construction, highway projects that required relocating entire hillsides. What they're describing at Giza isn't just difficult, it's organizationally impossible. You're talking about precision that requires measurement tools we didn't invent until the 20th century, applied to a construction project that would challenge us today, even with unlimited budgets." Torres pulled out his phone and showed Holbrook photographs from a recent project, the relocation of a 200-ton transformer for a power plant. This single component required 6 months of planning, custom transport equipment, and a crew of specialists. We had computer modeling, GPS positioning, hydraulic systems that cost more than most people's houses, and we moved one piece, 200 tons, 5 miles. They're telling us the Egyptians moved 2.3 million pieces, some weighing 350% more, over distances of 500 miles, and fitted them together with tolerances we struggle to achieve in climate-controlled factories. The economic analysis was equally damning. When financial modeling firms ran the numbers on pyramid construction using ancient methods, the cost estimates defied belief. Patricia Sterling, Holbrook's wife and a researcher specializing in economic history, had spent months analyzing resource requirements for large-scale ancient construction projects. Her conclusions made sobering reading. The project would have required resources equivalent to multiple years of Egypt's entire economic output, she explained to her husband one evening as they reviewed her research in their suburban Denver home. We're not talking about a significant investment or even a major national undertaking. We're talking about economic mobilization on a scale that would have consumed every available resource in the ancient Egyptian economy and left the civilization financially devastated for generations. Patricia had built economic models based on similar massive undertakings throughout history, from the construction of Versailles to the Manhattan Project. Each comparison made the Pyramid Project seem more impossible. Modern nations with industrial economies struggle to sustain projects of this magnitude, she continued, spreading charts across their kitchen table. We're supposed to believe that a Bronze Age agricultural economy accomplished something that would challenge the United States today. Yet, historical records showed no evidence of such economic strain during Khufu's reign. No texts describing the impoverishment of the kingdom, no archaeological evidence of the economic disruption that should have accompanied such massive resource allocation. Instead, the period was remembered as one of prosperity and cultural achievement. It was as if the greatest construction project in human history had been accomplished as an afterthought, requiring no more effort than building a modest temple. More troubling still was the complete absence of any contemporary documentation about the actual construction process. This silence gnawed at Patricia Sterling's historian instincts, like a persistent ache. The Khufu Egyptians were obsessive record keepers, documenting everything from grain harvests to minor temple repairs with bureaucratic thoroughness that would impress a modern accounting firm. They recorded the names of architects, the number of workers, the cost of materials, the time required for completion. They carved detailed accounts of construction projects into stone walls where they could endure for millennia. Yet the greatest construction project in human history merited barely a mention in their extensive archives. The only evidence linking the pyramid to Khufu consisted of a few quarry marks painted inside sealed chambers, discovered by 19th-century explorers in circumstances that modern scholars increasingly questioned. These marks, supposedly left by work crews, appeared in spaces that would have been inaccessible during construction, painted on stones that would never have been seen by human eyes. It's not just what they didn't write, Patricia told her husband one evening as they reviewed archaeological reports. It's what they did write. When later pharaohs described great construction projects, they always emphasized the newness, the innovation, the glory of their achievement. They boasted about surpassing their ancestors, about building monuments that would outshine everything that came before. But with the pyramids, especially the Great Pyramid, the language is completely different. She pulled out photocopies of ancient texts, hieroglyphic inscriptions that had been translated and retranslated by generations of scholars. They speak of restoration, of maintaining what was already ancient, of doing as the ancestors did. They describe themselves not as creators, but as custodians, not as innovators, but as inheritors. It's as if they're claiming credit for maintaining something rather than building something. This pattern appeared throughout Egyptian history with uncomfortable consistency. Time and again, pharaohs claimed not to be building something new, but restoring something old. Temples were rebuilt according to the writings of old. Monuments were restored as they were in the time of the ancestors. The Egyptians seemed to see themselves not as creators, but as caretakers of a legacy that stretched back to something they called Zep Tepi, the first time. Zep Tepi, the first time. The mythical golden age when gods walked the earth and knowledge was perfect. Most scholars dismissed these references as religious mythology, the kind of nostalgic idealization that every culture develops about its distant past. But Patricia Sterling had begun to wonder if something more concrete lay behind the consistent pattern of language, something that explained why the Egyptians seemed so determined to position themselves as inheritors rather than innovators. The astronomical alignments added another layer to the mystery, one that brought hard science into collision with established chronology. Dr. Amanda Reynolds from the Smithsonian's Astrophysics Division had spent 3 years analyzing the Great Pyramid's internal shafts, those mysterious corridors that seemed to serve no practical purpose in a tomb. What she found challenged everything archaeologists thought they knew about the monument's construction date. The shafts pointed with laser-like precision to specific stars and constellations. Not the stars as they appeared during Khufu's reign in 2580 BCE, but the stars as they appeared during a much earlier epoch. The alignments corresponded perfectly to the sky of approximately 10,500 BCE, nearly 8,000 years before the supposed construction date. This wasn't a minor discrepancy that could be explained away by measurement error or symbolic interpretation. It was a fundamental disconnect that suggested the pyramid had been designed during a completely different astronomical epoch. The shaft alignments are perfect for the sky of 10,500 BCE, Dr. Reynolds reported to a closed session of the American Astronomical Society. They're off by exactly the amount you'd expect from precession over 8 millennia. Either the builders possessed a sophisticated understanding of astronomical precession and deliberately encoded an ancient date into their monument, or the monument itself dates to that period. Precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that changes the apparent position of stars over thousands of years, was supposedly unknown to ancient civilizations. It requires sustained observation over multiple generations to detect the kind of patient, systematic astronomy that modern science assumed was beyond Bronze Age capabilities. Yet someone had encoded precise knowledge of precession into the pyramid's design, creating alignments that would only make sense to observers who understood how the heavens changed over vast spans of time. The implications were staggering. If the pyramid did indeed date to 10,500 BCE, it would place its construction at the end of the last ice age, during a period of catastrophic global climate change. Sea levels rose hundreds of feet as massive ice sheets melted. Coastlines were redrawn overnight. Entire ecosystems vanished as the planet's climate system reorganized itself around new patterns of temperature and rainfall. It was precisely the kind of global catastrophe that could erase a civilization, leaving behind only its most durable monuments. Holbrook Sterling found himself thinking about that time frame during his daily commute through Denver traffic, watching the city's skyline emerge from morning haze. 10,000 years ago, his city wouldn't have existed. Neither would the highways he traveled, the mountains whose peaks were visible on clear days, even the rivers that carved the valleys where millions of people now lived. The landscape itself would have been alien, shaped by retreating glaciers and changing weather patterns that no living human had witnessed. Yet according to Dr. Reynolds' calculations, the Great Pyramid's builders had been there, surviving that transformation, encoding their knowledge of the changing heavens into stone that could outlast ice ages. They had possessed not just the engineering skills to move millions of tons of stone with unprecedented precision, but the astronomical knowledge to create alignments accurate across geological timescales. But perhaps the most compelling evidence came from an unexpected source: corporate America's own expertise in large-scale construction projects. When Holbrook Sterling presented his preliminary findings to a private symposium of Fortune 500 construction executives, the response was unanimous and sobering. Every executive in the room agreed that the Great Pyramid represented an engineering achievement that exceeded their own capabilities, even with unlimited budgets and modern technology. Thomas Brennan, CEO of one of America's largest construction companies, had built everything from subway systems to space launch facilities. His assessment was blunt. We couldn't do it, not with our current technology, not with our current organizational methods. The precision requirements alone would bankrupt us. We're talking about tolerances that we can achieve in a factory setting with computer-controlled machinery, applied to a structure covering 13 acres. The organizational complexity would be beyond anything we've ever attempted. This wasn't the romantic speculation of amateur archaeologists or the theoretical musings of university professors. This was the professional assessment of men who moved billions of tons of material every year, who understood the realities of large-scale construction better than anyone on Earth. They were looking at the Great Pyramid the way a Formula One engineer might look at a spacecraft, recognizing superior technology when they saw it, even if they couldn't explain how it worked. The silence in official archaeological circles wasn't difficult to understand. Academic careers were built on established timelines and accepted theories. Peer review systems rewarded incremental advances within existing frameworks, not revolutionary challenges to fundamental assumptions. To suggest that human civilization might be far older than previously believed, that advanced knowledge might have existed in prehistoric times, was to court professional suicide in a field where reputation meant everything. It was easier to maintain that copper chisels and human determination had somehow achieved the impossible than to confront the possibility that our understanding of the past might be fundamentally incomplete. Academic institutions had invested too much in existing timelines to abandon them for uncomfortable evidence. Grant funding, tenure tracks, entire departments were built around established chronologies. To suggest otherwise was to threaten the foundation of modern archaeology. But outside the ivory towers of academia, in the practical world of engineering and construction, a quiet revolution was taking place. Men like Holbrook Sterling, professionals who understood the realities of building at scale, were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions, not because they wanted to overturn established history, but because the evidence demanded honest evaluation from people who actually knew how to move mountains. The inheritance theory offered a different framework for understanding Egypt's achievement, one that didn't require believing in impossible accomplishments with inadequate tools. Rather than seeing the Egyptians as the builders of impossible monuments, it cast them as the inheritors and preservers of something far older. This didn't diminish their civilization. It elevated it. They became the keepers of humanity's greatest legacy, the bridge between a lost world and our own. Consider the implications from an engineering perspective. If the Great Pyramid was inherited rather than built by the Fourth Dynasty, it would explain the impossible precision without requiring magic. It would explain the missing construction infrastructure without invoking ancient organizational genius beyond human capability. It would explain the documentary silence without assuming that history's greatest record keepers somehow forgot to document their greatest achievement. The Egyptians would have discovered a monument already ancient, already weathered by thousands of years of climate that no longer existed. Their role would have been that of restoration specialists, maintaining and protecting something they recognized as sacred but didn't fully understand. They would have been like modern engineers discovering an alien spacecraft, capable of recognizing its sophistication, perhaps even able to maintain its basic functions, but unable to recreate the technology that built it. This scenario aligned perfectly with Egyptian mythology and self-perception. They consistently described themselves as living in the shadow of a golden age, when gods walked the earth and knowledge was perfect. Their entire civilization was organized around the principle of maintaining cosmic order, of preserving balance against the forces of chaos. If they had inherited a monument from that mythical golden age, their reverence for it would explain both its preservation and the creation of an entire culture dedicated to maintaining eternal order. The global evidence supported this interpretation with uncomfortable consistency. Across continents, ancient cultures preserved remarkably similar stories of advanced civilizations destroyed by cataclysmic floods. From Mesopotamian tablets describing antediluvian kings to Native American oral traditions recounting the destruction of previous worlds, the pattern repeated with variations. A golden age ends in catastrophe. Survivors carry fragments of knowledge to new lands, and civilization slowly rebuilds around the remnants of what was lost. The Great Pyramid might be the most durable remnant of such, a lost civilization. Built not for a pharaoh's tomb, but as a repository of knowledge, designed to survive not decades or centuries, but geological epochs. Its astronomical alignments would have served as a calendar for survivors, marking the slow precession of the equinoxes across vast spans of time. Its geometric proportions encoded fundamental mathematical constants, preserving knowledge that might otherwise be lost when languages died and libraries burned. From this perspective, Egypt's achievement wasn't construction, it was curation. They became history's greatest librarians, maintaining a repository of knowledge they inherited but didn't create. Their obsession with permanence, their resistance to change, their reverence for tradition all made sense as strategies for preserving something irreplaceable. They weren't trying to advance beyond their ancestors, they were trying to remain worthy of them. The engineering community's growing acceptance of the inheritance theory reflected a broader shift in how professionals understood technological progress. The old model of linear advancement, where each generation builds upon the last, was giving way to a more nuanced understanding of how knowledge could be lost and rediscovered. Silicon Valley executives who'd watched entire technologies vanish when companies failed understood how quickly institutional knowledge could disappear. Military historians who'd studied the loss of Roman concrete formulas or Greek fire recipes recognized that progress wasn't always permanent. Even within their own lifetimes, Holbrook and his colleagues had seen technologies peak and decline. The space shuttle program that had once represented the pinnacle of human engineering achievement had been retired, leaving America temporarily unable to send astronauts into space without Russian assistance. If modern industrial civilizations could lose the ability to repeat their greatest achievements within a single generation, what might have been lost over the course of millennia? The inheritance theory didn't require believing in ancient aliens or lost super technologies. It simply required accepting that human civilization might be more cyclical than progressive, that knowledge could accumulate and disperse in patterns more complex than steady advancement. It required acknowledging that the ancients might have known things we'd forgotten, achieved things we couldn't repeat, solved problems we were still struggling to understand. This humbling possibility haunted Holbrook Sterling during quiet moments in his office, when he'd set aside blueprints and cost estimates to stare out at the Denver skyline. The city represented everything modern engineering could accomplish: steel and glass towers that defied gravity, infrastructure systems that delivered power and water to millions, transportation networks that connected continents. Yet, for all their sophistication, these achievements felt fragile compared to the pyramids. Endurance. How many of Denver's buildings would still stand in 4,000 years? How much of humanity's current knowledge would survive if civilization faced the kind of catastrophe that ended the Ice Age? The technical details became more troubling the deeper he investigated. The pyramid's core structure revealed engineering principles that challenged modern understanding of ancient capabilities. Load distribution systems that should have required computer modeling, stress analysis that demanded knowledge of materials science, thermal expansion considerations that suggested understanding of physics concepts not formally recognized until the modern era. Dr. Jennifer Lawson, a structural engineer from MIT who specialized in ancient building techniques, had spent years analyzing the pyramid's internal architecture. Her findings painted a picture of engineering sophistication that shouldn't have existed in the Bronze Age. "The weight distribution is flawless," she explained to a symposium of engineering professionals. "Every stone placement serves multiple structural functions. It's not just strong, it's elegant. The kind of design you see when engineers have had centuries to refine their understanding of how forces interact within massive structures." The acoustic properties added another dimension to the mystery. The grand gallery inside the pyramid demonstrated sound characteristics that suggested deliberate acoustic design. When Dr. Lawson's team conducted acoustic testing, they discovered that the chamber could amplify certain frequencies while dampening others, creating a resonance effect that felt almost musical. The stones themselves seemed to vibrate in harmony, as if the entire structure was designed as a massive instrument. "It's not accidental," Dr. Lawson reported. "The dimensions, the angles, the material properties, they all work together to create specific acoustic effects. This isn't functional architecture for a tomb. This is precision engineering for a purpose we don't understand." But perhaps the most unsettling discovery came from comparative analysis with other ancient structures worldwide. The inheritance pattern wasn't unique to Egypt. Across the globe, archaeologists were finding evidence of sophisticated megalithic construction that seemed to appear suddenly in the archaeological record, without the gradual development phases that should have preceded such advanced techniques. In Peru, the stone walls of Sacsayhuaman displayed cutting and fitting techniques that paralleled those found in the Great Pyramid. Massive blocks fitted together with impossible precision, surfaces polished to mirror smoothness, joints so tight that mortar became unnecessary. The official explanations involved bronze tools and patient labor, but the same mathematical impossibilities that plagued pyramid construction applied here as well. In Lebanon, the foundation stones at Baalbek exceeded even the pyramid's megaliths in size. Individual blocks weighing over 800 tons, cut and positioned with accuracy that challenged modern heavy lifting capabilities. The Roman temples built on top of these foundations, impressive as they were, seemed crude by comparison to the megalithic base that supported them. In Turkey, Göbekli Tepe presented perhaps the most disturbing evidence of all. Carbon dating placed the site's construction at approximately 9,500 BCE, predating agriculture itself according to conventional timelines. Yet the sophistication of the stone carving, the complexity of the architectural planning, the evidence of astronomical knowledge embedded in the site's layout, all suggested a level of civilization that shouldn't have existed among supposed hunter-gatherer societies. The pattern was global and consistent. Sophisticated megalithic construction appearing suddenly in the archaeological record, displaying engineering capabilities that exceeded the supposed technological context of their time periods, followed by gradual decline in technique and precision. It was as if multiple civilizations across the world had inherited similar technologies, maintained them for a time, then lost the knowledge as generations passed. This global perspective transformed Holbrook's understanding of the Great Pyramid from an isolated Egyptian mystery into part of a worldwide phenomenon. The inheritance theory wasn't just about one monument or one civilization. It was about the possibility that human history followed patterns of rise and decline more complex than the steady progression from primitive to advanced that modern education assumed. The implications extended beyond archaeology into philosophy and human self-understanding. If advanced civilizations had risen and fallen before recorded history, if knowledge could be accumulated and lost in cycles measured in millennia rather than generations, then humanity's current achievements might be less unique than assumed. The Industrial Revolution, the space age, the digital transformation. Perhaps these weren't humanity's first attempts at technological sophistication, but its latest attempt to recover capabilities that had been achieved and lost before. Such thoughts carried both humility and hope. Humility in recognizing that modern civilization might not represent the pinnacle of human achievement, that the ancients might have solved problems still challenging contemporary science. But also hope that if such knowledge had existed once, it could exist again. That human ingenuity and determination could overcome catastrophe and loss to rebuild what was destroyed. The pyramid stood as proof of both possibilities, that human hands could achieve the seemingly impossible, and that such achievements could endure long enough to inspire future generations to reach for their own version of greatness. Holbrook Sterling's personal journey with the inheritance theory had evolved from professional curiosity to something approaching obsession, though he was careful not to use that word when discussing his research with colleagues. Over the past 3 years, he had assembled a network of professionals across multiple disciplines, all united by the uncomfortable recognition that conventional explanations for ancient megalithic construction simply didn't hold up to rigorous analysis. The network included men like Richard Carmichael, a retired Navy Seabee who had overseen construction projects in some of the world's most challenging environments. Carmichael brought a practical military perspective to discussions about ancient logistics. You don't move 2.3 million tons of material without leaving massive infrastructure footprints, he would tell anyone willing to listen. I've built forward operating bases in places where we had to import every nut and bolt, and the support infrastructure always exceeds the primary construction by a factor of 3 or 4. Always. The Giza Plateau should be littered with evidence of massive support operations. Instead, we find a few copper chisels and some worker barracks. It's like finding evidence that someone built a carrier battle group with hand tools and a rowboat. Then there was William Fletcher, a project management specialist who had coordinated billion-dollar infrastructure projects across 6 continents. Fletcher approached the pyramid construction timeline with the systematic methodology that had made him legendary in corporate construction circles. His analysis was devastating to conventional chronology. 20 years to complete the project using accepted ancient methods would require precision scheduling that exceeds anything we've achieved in modern construction, he concluded. Every single day for 2 decades, crews would need to quarry, transport, and precisely position an average of 315 blocks weighing multiple tons each. No delays for weather, no time for correcting mistakes, no allowance for the learning curve that accompanies any complex undertaking. And this assumes perfect coordination between quarry operations hundreds of miles away, transportation systems that we can't identify archaeological evidence for, and positioning accuracy that we struggle to achieve with laser-guided equipment. The more Holbrook studied the problem, the more convinced he became that the inheritance theory represented the only rational explanation that didn't require believing in impossible achievements with inadequate tools. But conviction and proof were different things, and the evidence, while compelling, remained circumstantial. The pyramid couldn't speak for itself, couldn't testify to its own origins. It simply stood there, silent and perfect, challenging every assumption about human technological development. Late one evening in his home office, surrounded by photographs of megalithic sites from around the world, Holbrook found himself thinking about his grandfather, a man who had worked construction during the Great Depression. His grandfather had built some of the infrastructure that still served Denver today, using techniques and tools that seemed primitive by modern standards. Yet those bridges and buildings had endured, requiring minimal maintenance, displaying a kind of honest craftsmanship that felt increasingly rare in the modern world of planned obsolescence and quarterly profit reports. What if the pyramid builders had possessed that same honest craftsmanship, but elevated to levels his grandfather couldn't have imagined? What if they had built not for pharaohs or glory, but for the same reason his grandfather had laid foundations meant to last for generations? Because that's what good craftsmen did? They built things to endure. Patricia Sterling had been watching her husband's deepening involvement with the inheritance theory with a mixture of admiration and concern. She understood the intellectual satisfaction he derived from challenging established assumptions, but she also recognized the emotional toll of pursuing questions that couldn't be definitively answered. "You're not going to solve this," she told him one night as he reviewed acoustic analysis reports from the Grand Gallery. "Not completely. The evidence is too fragmentary, the timeline too remote. But that doesn't mean the investigation isn't worthwhile." Her words carried wisdom that extended beyond the pyramid mystery. Some questions mattered more for the asking than the answering. The process of investigation, of careful analysis, of following evidence wherever it led, these had value independent of reaching final conclusions. The inheritance theory had already changed how Holbrook viewed human achievement, had expanded his understanding of what was possible, had connected him with a community of professionals united by intellectual honesty rather than academic politics. The pyramid had become a teacher, though not in the way he had expected. It taught patience with uncertainty, respect for achievements that transcended their creators, and appreciation for the long view of human accomplishment. Whether built or inherited, the monument stood as proof that human hands could create something eternal, something that spoke across millennia to minds willing to listen. As winter settled over Denver, Holbrook found himself returning repeatedly to a simple realization. The inheritance theory mattered not because it solved every mystery surrounding the Great Pyramid, but because it offered a framework for understanding human achievement that was both more humble and more hopeful than conventional narratives. More humble in recognizing that modern civilization might not represent the pinnacle of human accomplishment. More hopeful in demonstrating that knowledge and craftsmanship could survive even the collapse of the civilizations that created them. The pyramid had taught him something else as well, that the greatest human achievements often transcended the intentions of their creators. Whether built by fourth, dynasty Egyptians or inherited from an earlier civilization, the monument had outlasted its original purpose to become something larger, a symbol of human aspiration, a challenge to conventional thinking, a reminder that the past might hold more mysteries than the future. This realization had professional implications that extended far beyond archaeological debates. In his own construction work, Holbrook had begun thinking differently about durability and purpose. The projects that mattered most weren't necessarily the most profitable or the most technically challenging, but the ones built with the kind of long-term thinking that characterized the pyramid's design. Infrastructure meant to serve not just immediate needs, but the needs of generations yet unborn. The inheritance theory had attracted attention from unexpected quarters. Dr. Robert Kellner from Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory had approached Holbrook after a presentation at an engineering conference, bringing with him insights from materials science that added another layer to the mystery. Kellner's team had analyzed microscopic samples from various megalithic sites using techniques developed for studying nuclear materials. The stonework displays evidence of cutting techniques that shouldn't have been available to Bronze Age civilizations, Kellner reported. "We're seeing precision at the molecular level, surface treatments that suggest thermal manipulation, tool marks that indicate cutting speeds inconsistent with hand tools. Either these civilizations possessed manufacturing capabilities that we're only beginning to understand, or they inherited structures built using technologies that subsequently disappeared from the archaeological record." Kellner's analysis extended beyond Egypt to include samples from Pumapunku in Bolivia, where massive stone blocks displayed cutting precision that challenged contemporary understanding of ancient capabilities. The blocks showed evidence of machine-like regularity, angles cut to tolerances measured in fractions of degrees, surfaces finished to mirror smoothness despite being composed of some of the hardest stone on Earth. The global pattern was becoming undeniable to anyone willing to examine the evidence without preconceptions. Advanced megalithic construction appeared suddenly in the archaeological record across multiple continents, displaying technical sophistication that exceeded the supposed capabilities of their time periods, then gradually declined as subsequent civilizations attempted to replicate techniques they only partially understood. For Holbrook Sterling, this pattern resonated with observations from his own professional experience. He had witnessed firsthand how construction techniques could be lost when experienced craftsmen retired without passing on their knowledge, how institutional expertise could vanish when companies failed or projects ended. If such knowledge could disappear within his own lifetime in a civilization with universities, libraries, and digital storage, how much more easily might it vanish across the vast spans of prehistoric time? The inheritance theory offered a framework that explained not just the pyramid's impossible precision, but the curious mixture of sophistication and limitation that characterized ancient Egyptian civilization more broadly. They were masters of astronomy and mathematics, capable of calculating celestial cycles with extraordinary accuracy. Yet they never developed the wheel for transportation, never progressed beyond bronze tools despite having access to iron ore, never created the kinds of mechanical innovations that should have followed naturally from their engineering achievements. This technological profile made perfect sense if they were inheritors rather than inventors, maintaining knowledge they didn't fully understand, preserving techniques they couldn't improve upon. Like modern technicians servicing equipment they didn't design, they could operate systems beyond their ability to create. Their achievements reflected not innovation, but faithful preservation of inherited wisdom. The emotional weight of this realization had grown heavier over the months since Holbrook first began seriously investigating the inheritance theory. If correct, it meant that human civilization was far more fragile than generally assumed. That knowledge could be lost completely. That technological sophistication could vanish, leaving only monuments as proof it had ever existed. That the progression from simple to complex might be an illusion, masking cycles of achievement and loss that stretched back far beyond recorded history. But there was hope in the inheritance model as well. It suggested that human potential was greater than modern achievements indicated, that previous civilizations had solved problems still challenging contemporary science. The pyramid stood as proof that human ingenuity could create works of enduring significance, monuments that carried meaning across millennia, even when their original purpose was forgotten. As the investigation deepened, Holbrook found himself thinking less about solving the pyramid mystery and more about what it meant to be part of a civilization that might itself be temporary. How should one build, knowing that the society supporting the work might not endure? How should knowledge be preserved when institutions proved fragile? What responsibilities did the present generation bear toward both the past and future? These weren't abstract philosophical questions. They were practical considerations that affected how one approached work, family, community. The pyramid builders, whether Egyptian or pre-Egyptian, had answered these questions through their choice to build for eternity rather than immediate utility. They had created something that outlasted their civilization, their language, their very names, carrying forward proof that human achievement could transcend the limitations of any single era. Tonight, as the desert cooling air settles over the Giza Plateau as it has for thousands of years, the Great Pyramid stands where it always has. Silent, patient, enduring, the stars wheel overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human theories about who built what and when. The monument itself offers no opinions, makes no claims, settles no debates. It simply exists, a fact too massive to ignore, too precise to dismiss, too mysterious to fully understand. You've followed this investigation alongside Holbrook Sterling, witnessed the mounting evidence that challenges everything we've been told about humanity's greatest architectural achievement, the impossible precision that exceeds Bronze Age capabilities, the missing infrastructure that should have dwarfed the pyramid itself, the documentary silence that surrounds history's most ambitious construction project, the astronomical alignments that point to a sky 8,000 years older than the supposed construction date. The evidence accumulates like sediment, layer upon layer, each stratum adding weight to the possibility that the Great Pyramid wasn't built by the Egyptians at all, but inherited by them, maintained by them, preserved by them with the kind of reverent care reserved for something recognized as sacred but not fully understood. But perhaps the most compelling evidence isn't technical or academic. Perhaps it's the simple recognition that human achievement sometimes takes forms we don't immediately recognize, that progress isn't always linear, that knowledge can accumulate and disperse in cycles more complex than steady advancement from primitive to sophisticated. The inheritance theory doesn't solve every mystery. It doesn't answer every question. But it offers something perhaps more valuable, a reminder that human achievement might reach back further than we know, that our ancestors might have been capable of more than we've imagined, and that the greatest wisdom sometimes lies not in what we build, but in what we choose to preserve. Holbrook Sterling's investigation had transformed him in ways he hadn't anticipated. The man who had begun this journey as a successful construction engineer focused on quarterly profits and project deadlines had evolved into something more philosophical, more patient with uncertainty, more appreciative of achievements that transcended their creators. The pyramid had taught him that some questions mattered more for the asking than the answering, that some mysteries enriched understanding simply by existing. Standing in his Denver office on a winter evening, looking out at a skyline filled with buildings he had helped create, Holbrook found himself wondering which of these modern achievements might endure long enough to puzzle future civilizations. Which structures carried within their design the kind of intentional permanence that characterized the pyramid? Which embodied values worth preserving beyond the civilization that created them? The pyramid builders, whether Egyptian or pre-Egyptian, had answered these questions through their choice to build for eternity rather than immediate utility. They had encoded knowledge into stone that could outlast languages, civilizations, even ice ages. They had created something that spoke to every generation that encountered it, not through words, but through the universal language of precision, proportion, and endurance. As you return to your own world, your own work, your own daily concerns, carry with you this reminder from the Great Pyramid, that human achievement sometimes wears masks we don't immediately recognize, that the past might be more extraordinary than the present, and that the greatest monuments aren't always the ones we build, but the ones we choose to preserve for reasons that transcend our immediate understanding. The desert wind moves across the ancient stones tonight, carrying sand that was once mountains, once ocean floors, once the bones of creatures that lived when the world was young. The pyramid breathes with that wind, settling imperceptibly as temperature changes, moving with the planet's rotation, participating in cosmic rhythms that dwarf human timekeeping. Somewhere in that rhythm, that patient dance between earth and sky, stone and star, the truth waits. Not demanding, not insisting, but simply there, as enduring as the monument itself, as constant as the turning of the heavens above Giza. The pyramid has outlasted the pharaohs who claimed it, the empires that conquered it, the scholars who studied it. It will outlast our theories too. And in that endurance, that silent patience, lies something worth inheriting ourselves. The understanding that the greatest human achievements transcend their creators, becoming gifts to a future that may not even remember the names of those who made them possible. The inheritance continues, flowing from the ancient builders to the Egyptians who preserved their work, from the Egyptians to modern investigators like Holbrook Sterling, from Sterling's generation to yours. The conversation between past and present, between what we know and what we wonder, carries on in the space between certainty and mystery, where the most profound truths often live. The pyramid doesn't speak to us. It allows us to listen. And in that listening, in that patient attention to possibilities larger than our assumptions, we become part of something greater than ourselves. The wind continues to move. The stars continue to turn. The pyramid continues to wait, holding its secrets with the same calm certainty it has maintained for millennia. The dialogue between stone and sky has never ended. It never will. And somewhere in that eternal conversation lies the essence of human aspiration itself. The desire to create something that outlasts our understanding, something that speaks to futures we'll never see, something that carries forward the best of what we are, even when we're gone,